In 2003, archaeologists working a limestone cave system in what is now southern France uncovered something that had been deliberately wedged into a narrow rock fissure nearly 40,000 years ago. A carefully carved figurine, barely 3 inches tall, depicting a human figure with the unmistakable head of a lion. Fashioned from woolly mammoth ivory by someone who clearly possessed both the technical skill and the psychological urgency to render the thing at all, spending hours on it rather than simply running from the creature it depicted. The figurine, called the Löwenmensch, which translates roughly as the Lion Man of the Swabian Alps, is among the oldest confirmed pieces of representational art yet recovered anywhere on Earth, and what it tells researchers about the inner life of the people who created it is considerably stranger and more revealing than the object itself might initially suggest to a casual observer holding it for the first time. So what actually frightened prehistoric humans most? The question sounds deceptively simple until you start following the physical evidence, at which point the answer sprawls outward in several directions at once, reaching back hundreds of thousands and in some cases millions of years into a world your ancestors navigated without any of the insulation from genuine mortal danger that you carry with you through an ordinary Tuesday without once stopping to appreciate it. The fears baked deepest into your nervous system weren't chosen or culturally transmitted in the way a childhood phobia might be. They were selected for, meaning the individuals who felt them most acutely and responded to them most quickly were, over successive generations stretching across geological time, simply the ones who survived long enough to pass their neurology forward. Heights are one of the clearest examples of this, and researchers studying what's called the visual cliff response have documented something genuinely striking about how early and how automatically this particular fear activates in human infants, typically appearing around the same developmental window, 6 to 14 months, when a child first becomes mobile enough that falling from any significant elevation becomes a realistic possibility for the first time. Developmental psychologist Eleanor Gibson first demonstrated this formally in the late 1950s, using a glass-top table that created the visual impression of a sudden drop. And what she found was that infants would refuse to crawl across the apparent edge even when their own mothers beckoned them forward from the other side, a response that doesn't require any prior falling experience to produce, and that shows up with consistent reliability across cultures with entirely different physical environments and child-rearing practices. The reason this fear is so deeply wired is not difficult to reconstruct once you consider the arboreal environment where primate evolution spent tens of millions of its most formative years, high in the forest canopy, where a moment's misjudgment about a branch's stability or a sudden lapse in grip strength meant an immediately fatal fall onto the ground far below, and where the individuals whose brains treated the visual perception of sudden depth with immediate, involuntary alarm were reliably the ones still alive in the morning. Your own visceral response to peering over the railing of a tall building, that specific lurch of the stomach that arrives before any conscious thought has time to form, is a direct inheritance from ancestors who were genuinely and regularly falling out of trees, in lethal ways. And the ones whose nervous systems didn't panic at height simply aren't in your family tree. Now, let's talk about contamination fear, because it has an evolutionary history just as old and just as well documented, even though modern people tend to experience it primarily as an aesthetic response. The instinctive recoil from spoiled food or festering wounds, or the specific category of disgust that hits when you encounter something visually associated with disease, rather than as the survival mechanism it originally was, and, in functional terms, still is. Psychologist Paul Rozin at the University of Pennsylvania has studied disgust responses across decades of experimental work and identified something he calls the core disgust system, a set of evolved sensitivities specifically tuned to biological contamination threats, including rotting organic matter, feces, body fluids, and anything that signals infection or parasitic load, all of which represented genuinely life-threatening hazards in a world without germ theory, antibiotics, or any meaningful understanding of how disease actually spread from one person to another. The system is dramatically oversensitive by modern standards, which is precisely the point, because an immune system that occasionally overreacts to a harmless stimulus costs almost nothing in evolutionary terms, while an immune system that fails to trigger when genuine pathogens are present can kill you before you reproduce, and natural selection has no mechanism for correcting errors in the direction of excessive caution, the way it mercilessly corrects errors in the direction of insufficient caution over enough generations. This is why you can feel genuine, powerful disgust at the idea of drinking from a glass that someone merely told you had been used by a stranger, even after it's been thoroughly washed, even when your conscious mind fully understands that no actual contamination risk remains, because the disgust system isn't listening to your conscious mind at all. Strangers represented a threat category that was, for most of human evolutionary history, genuinely and statistically serious in ways that are difficult to reconstruct from inside a modern social environment built around anonymous coexistence with millions of people you'll never personally know. For the vast majority of human prehistory, your social world consisted of a relatively small band of perhaps 20 to 50 individuals whose faces, temperaments, and likely intentions you knew in exhaustive detail, and any human being outside that group represented a genuinely unknown quantity at best and a direct competitor for resources, territory, or mates at worst, with violence between neighboring groups being well documented archaeologically across dozens of separate excavation sites on mole, tipple continents. Psychologist Henri Tajfel's work on what he called social identity theory demonstrated how quickly and automatically humans sort unfamiliar people into in-group and out-group categories, and how dramatically different the neural processing of those two categories turns out to be, with out-group faces activating the amygdala, your brain's primary threat detection structure, at rates measurably higher than in-group faces, even under experimental conditions carefully designed to strip away any rational basis for that distinction. Loud, sudden sounds occupy a special category in human fear architecture, because the startle response they trigger is genuinely one of the fastest and most involuntary reactions the human nervous system produces, occurring within milliseconds of the triggering stimulus, before any conscious recognition of what the sound was or where it originated has had time to form, and activating a cascade of physiological responses, including heart rate acceleration, muscle contraction, and orienting behavior that essentially commandeers your entire body without asking your permission first. Researcher Michael Davis at Yale spent years mapping the specific neural circuitry underlying acoustic startle responses and found that the pathway runs through the amygdala in a loop so tight and so rapid that it effectively bypasses the cortical processing that produces conscious experience almost entirely, meaning that you've already begun physically reacting to a sudden loud noise before the part of your brain capable of forming opinions about it has received the relevant information. The evolutionary rationale for this is straightforward enough in retrospect, because in an environment where a sudden loud sound most plausibly meant a large animal crashing through nearby vegetation, or a rock fall beginning above you on a slope, or a rival group moving through territory at closer range than expected, the individuals whose bodies were already in motion before their conscious minds had fully processed the situation were, generation after generation, consistently the individuals still breathing. The cost of a false alarm, briefly elevated heart rate, and a moment of unnecessary vigilance was negligible against the benefit of genuine alarms. And so the reflex was tuned for maximum sensitivity rather than maximum precision, which is why a car backfiring on a quiet street can still send your entire nervous system into a state of emergency readiness that takes several minutes to fully stand down from. Fire is worth its own careful consideration here, because its relationship to prehistoric human fear is more complicated than simple terror of a destructive natural force, since early humans didn't merely fear fire the way your ancestors might have feared a tsunami or a volcanic eruption, as a catastrophic event to flee from and survive if possible. There's growing evidence from sites including Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, where controlled fire use dates back roughly 1 million years, that fire occupied an extraordinarily complex cognitive and emotional position for prehistoric people, functioning simultaneously as a source of warmth, a tool for processing food, a means of keeping nocturnal predators at bay, and a source of visual and auditory stimulation that researchers like anthropologist Polly Wiesner at the University of Utah have suggested was specifically associated with storytelling, social bonding, and the transmission of cultural knowledge across generations, gathered around the hearth after dark, which makes the fear of losing the fire, of being without it, of watching the last ember die in a situation where rekindling it wasn't guaranteed or straightforward, something qualitatively different from a simple fear of flame itself, and considerably more existential than that framing captures, because without fire, your ancestors were blind at night, cold in winter, undefended against the animals that hunted most effectively in the dark, and cut off from the specific social rituals that fire made possible. Researcher Wiesner's work analyzing ethnographic data from Juhon hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari found that the content of conversations held around evening fires differed dramatically from daytime conversation, shifting heavily toward emotionally resonant storytelling, accounts of distant people and places, and the kind of information that builds and maintains extended social networks, suggesting that firelight wasn't merely a convenience for prehistoric people, but something structurally embedded in how they understood themselves and their relationship to the wider social world. The fears that cut deepest into prehistoric human experience weren't isolated sensations attached to individual objects or creatures, but something woven throughout the entire texture of daily existence in a world that offered your ancestors no stable guarantees about continued survival, where any given morning could reasonably end in predation, starvation, group violence, disease, or the simple catastrophic bad luck of being in the wrong terrain when a storm arrived. Contemporary researchers studying the deep structure of human anxiety, including figures like Arne Oman at the Karolinska Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, have argued that what we experience today as anxiety disorders, phobias, and hypervigilance are in most cases not malfunctions of a correctly calibrated system, but rather the entire predictable outputs of a system that was calibrated for a world incomparably more dangerous than the one most people reading this currently inhabit. Still running quietly